Okie doke.
Thank you. Should I
So,
give you a little intro, Nick?
well, you could do, but we're a bit late, so keep it
Okay.
short, please.
So just to say welcome from Tracking the Impact, part of Chalk Cherries and Chairs. I'm the project manager, and which is led by the Chilterns National Landscape. So really great to have you all, both Tracking the Impact volunteers and also from the wider area from Butterfly Conservation. So really great to have you. I'm going to pass you over to Nick because he knows everything
Very
about
much.
that. Okay, over to you.
Right, so recording butterflies, moths through standardized surveys. Let's click on this. I'm afraid, people, I am going to have to go pretty fast because there's a lot to cover and I want to give you time for questions. So first of all, why make so much effort to record butterflies and moths? And you're supposed at this point to be thinking of the answer and not waiting for me to tell you. So why do you think that we encourage people to go out there and do it? The answer, because we wouldn't know what was rare, we wouldn't know what was in need of help. So perhaps not very rare at the moment, but declining fast is also in need of help. This, I know it's not local, couldn't find a local one when I was searching around earlier, but in Newcastle, look, the fact that a tiny butterfly, as they put it, was becoming scarce in that region meant that a housing development was stopped. So it can have, depending upon your viewpoint, if you're the developer in this case, you wouldn't agree with me, but it can have really positive outcomes. We can actually get things changed as a result of our recording, things which I would say were good for the environment. And why do we want to do it in such a complicated, well, it's not really a very complicated way, but a more complicated way? Why not just walk around in the countryside and tell somebody what you've seen? The answer is, as you can see, it says there, I'm not going to read all these to you people. I'll assume that all of you are capable of reading probably faster than I can read it. So it's just that if people go out and record willy-nilly, ad hoc, using any system they like, when one person reports that they've seen 10 of something and somebody else goes to a different place and reports they've seen 20, we really don't know whether that means that the second site was twice as good as the first, because we don't know if they spent twice as long there or were looking over a bigger area. We don't know whether they were there in slightly better weather than the person who saw 10. So everything is standardized so that you can compare things with much more chance of being accurate when you say that one site appears to be doing better. Because then we can talk about, well, what's the management? What's the habitat condition at that site? What is it that makes it better? And as you'll see in the middle bit, it says, not only does all this inform on our own science, which you possibly know, but butterfly conservation science publications are top-rated things that loads of people reference, but it goes into our own government's statistical analyses of all sorts of things, and even the European Union's. The European Union use our data because it's considered to be far better than anything that they've got. Right. We enjoy doing it too, of course. Now, there are three types of standardized surveys which butterfly conservation have introduced. There's the two at the top that we're going to concentrate on today, the transect walk and the wider countryside butterfly survey. I will in passing mention single species at the end of the talk. So what do you need? So we've got to the bit now, folks, where you need to pay a bit more attention. So I've got a list here of things that I believe you need. And I'm going to mention just a few of them, pick a few out. So for instance, the thermometer. If you're going to use your car and the onboard thermometer in your car that tells you what the temperature is outside, please remember you're supposed to be taking, and that's why I've made it a slightly bigger text here, look, shade temperature. You're driving along the road towards wherever you're going to do your surveying, you're probably not in the shade, because the middle of most roads where the cars go tend to be far enough away from the trees and the buildings that you're in the sun, and the sun shining on the black asphalt of the roadway means that the temperature the car reads is higher than it would be even if it was in the shade, because it's absorbed a lot more heat being a black surface and it's radiating more heat being a black surface. So your car's thermometer is unlikely to give you the correct shade temperature. What I suggest you do, if you don't want to carry a thermometer around with you, is that you do a simple test. See what your car tells you one day while you've got a thermometer sat in the shade close by, so that you can check and compare the two. My own car is about 1 degree C above what it should tell me. So I simply look to see what my car says and take 1 degree C away. The optional bits down here, one of them I would say actually, although I put it in to optional, this charged phone, I've decided that was a bit silly of me. You do need a way to summon help. In theory, you don't ever do any surveying if you know that it could be dangerous. But of course, unexpected things happen. And you put your foot into a rabbit hole, twist your ankle, can't get back to your car, you need a phone. So although it does say optional to take a charged phone, I think that probably ought to be upgraded. And I would argue with anyone that it would be a really good idea to take a net. Now, I know there are some people who are violently opposed to the idea of catching the butterflies in order to identify them, but without it, your job is going to be much harder. So I think it's a good idea to take a net along too. And the camera, by the way, can't really be used while you're doing the actual walking on the surveys, but between sections, as they're called, you could stop and take some pictures. We'll come on to that. Okay, now I've got the same information that's there written in a list for those of us that are visual learners here in a picture. I've got no idea where that is that those people are looking, but it was a picture of people doing some survey work. So you might want to take pen and paper at the top here. I prefer personally, I just make all my notes in my phone. It's a lot quicker and I don't have to carry the pen and paper as well because I'm taking the phone. A map's a good idea if you know you're going somewhere where your phone won't get signal and you're afraid you might get lost in some sense, and then the map could be helpful. Binoculars are useful, but not very often when you're on transect, because occasionally there will be something that will fly through the survey area that you're working in and then settle just outside it. Or it will be a butterfly that you've noticed is extremely skittish, and every time you get anywhere near identifying it, it zips away again. So then you can see things without getting right on top of them. You'll need close focus binoculars for that. I just said about a net. If you wear glasses, in order to read, you might need to take glasses with you, not to see the butterflies, but to write down what you've seen and have it legible. Might sound silly, but it's true. And some people say they like to take an identification guide. I would argue against that personally, because if you need to look things up, you've got to stand still and page through your identification guide, and you should be walking your transect. So try to avoid it. It might be useful at the end of the walk to check some things to make sure you were right, but try not to use it while you're going around, because obviously it's going to cause you to stop repeatedly. And when you've seen that enormous list of things, this is obviously a very good point. This is supposed to be something that you go out and do as a volunteer and enjoy. If you've packed just about everything you can imagine that could keep you warm on a cold day, dry on a wet day, cool on a hot day, etc., etc., plus your lunch and a couple of drinks, all the other bits and pieces we've said, it could be very heavy. So try to keep the amount you carry to a minimum, but be sensible and do take protective equipment just in case the weather goes wrong. So we're going to get into the real nitty gritty of it in a minute, but I'm going to make this point because I always get this question. And by the way, I don't think we said this at the beginning. If you've got a question that you'd like to stick into the chat, that would be brilliant. If you want to put your hand up, that would be good too. And Anna's going to look for questions in the chat, and she's going to look for people with hands up. I'm going to pause every now and again and ask, are there any questions? At which point, by all means, unmute yourself and ask whatever it is you want to ask. But I'm going to fly along fairly fast in between those pauses. So as you'll have all have read this now while I was talking, it is absolutely the case that you are going to see butterflies and you are not going to record them because you won't know what they are. That is not a mistake on your part. That's you doing it properly. You should expect that you will go out and that you will come back, say, well, I didn't see very many butterflies and I actually only recorded 6, because quite a few of the things you see, you won't know what they were, especially the whites. But that's exactly right. And it's the way that all the people who are doing transects and WCBS walks properly, that's the way they record. They don't guess at things on the grounds that, well, there's usually a so-and-so here, so it's probably that. They record what they can identify with 100% certainty, and you don't guess. The various algorithms that they use to go through and sort out all the data at the end of it, when it gets back to the UK BMS, take into account that some species are harder to identify. Right, now I've decided I'd start with transect recording and we'd talk about that. And I've just put this page up for you to see that there is, if you haven't already found it, a page for the ukbms.org. You can see at the top here, the United Kingdom Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, and you can find out everything I'm telling you pretty much on that page. So everything is there, including the official statistics and the data from previously. There's loads of stuff there. I'm not going through that with you at the moment. I might come back to it at the end if we've got some time. And the wider countryside butterfly survey is at the same website, just down the page a bit. Again, masses and masses of information. So if at the end of this you think, oh, I should have asked about so-and-so, I'm not sure about that now, you can probably find the answer on the UK BMS website, where it tells you all about transects and wider countryside butterfly surveys and single species surveys too. So when we go out on our walks, in addition to all that clobber that I suggested you take, the people who are running the transect and wider countryside butterfly surveys, they ask us, please take one of these forms along. So we're going to be using this on our day's training when we go out on a Saturday in the near future. Some of you, I hope, are going to be able to join me on Saturday in 2 days' time. And I think it's fairly straightforward. You can see what it looks like. The wider countryside butterfly survey sheet, this one, looks so similar to the transect butterfly survey sheet, you might well think at first glance that they are the same. But in actual fact, they are slightly different. They've got exactly the same information recorded upon them, but it isn't necessarily in exactly the same place on the page. Why? I cannot tell you. Seems silly to me. Would have been better to make them identical, but they're not. Same information recorded, slightly different layout. So this one is the transect, and you see it looks slightly different. I'll just go back. Look, there we go. Wider countryside, which was produced later, has a cleaner look to it, doesn't it? And this is the original butterfly transect sheet. But both of them are much the same. Site name right in there where you are. Recorder, that will be you. Year, date. No, there's no point putting the year there. Just stick it in the date if you want to put it on. You don't really need it at all because it's obvious which year it is you're doing it now. Week number is optional. All the transect weeks begin with week number 1 as April the 1st. If anyone did a transect this week, and you can if you want, you can start, that would have been week -1. Start time, finish time, average temperature. Now that means take a note of the temperature when you begin and when you finish. Bias your average towards the higher temperature at the end. I don't mean write down the temperature at the end, bias towards it, because the temperature tends to go up quite quickly around about 11, 12 in the morning, and then it stays high. It rarely falls away during the day while you're doing your transect. Average wind speed, we'll talk a little bit more about that on the day. There is information here, but that's something that most people are worried they might get wrong. We'll definitely concentrate on that on the Saturday, either with me or if you're going out with Peter or with Marjorie, that will be covered. Wind direction, you can normally get this from a weather site, but you can also just look at the sky and look to see where the sun is and work out which way is the wind blowing from. And then we start recording. As you can see here, we've got spaces across here. This is a transect sheet. and it suggests you might have 15 sections. You might only have 2. I walk one of my transects, there's only 2 sections, so I only ever use these 2 columns, but you could have up to 15. The WCBS, we'll go back to it, only has 10, and it always has 10, but we'll come to that later. So this is the sheet you fill in. Now, one of the things that almost everybody forgets when they start walking these surveys is that you've got to record the amount of sunshine. So the wider countryside butterfly survey has a space for the sunshine here. Look right at the top. In the hope that people won't forget, I'm assuming you can see my mouse moving. Even if you can't, hopefully you can see sunshine % underneath the word section. The transect forms, some of them, it depends when you printed yours, transect forms have the same section here, sunshine, but right at the bottom of the page, which is a bit silly. All the other fields are identical, like the average temperature, as I've already said. They're just in different places. So there's the sunshine bit on the transect. Look right at the bottom. That's the bottom of the transect form. How silly. And it's no wonder, therefore, that people forget it, because they get back to their car, driving home, and thinking about filling in those data that they've collected on the UK BMS website, and suddenly think, oh, rude word. I didn't write down how much sunshine there was in every section. It's not the sunshine across the whole day. It's in each section separately. Now, with transect walks, you can go anywhere at all, provided the landowner knows you're going and agrees to it, and you know that walking around in that site isn't going to lead to you being injured in some way. So, for instance, some of us do a survey on MOD ground, and we have to make sure we're not going on a day when they're doing live firing. It sounds obvious, but this is the point. Don't do anything that puts you in danger. So the landowner agrees to you being there. You know you can walk the route you want to walk safely, and you can go anywhere you want. You can have any number of sections. And in this particular case, you can see the person has 11 sections. I've no idea where this is. I just pulled it down from the UK BMS website as an example. And you will notice the sections are not the same length. Section 1, look, is tiny compared with, say, section 10. The difference between each section should be, if your transect walk has been set up cleverly, that each section is a slightly different sort of habitat. So I'm expecting, I've not ever been to this site, that 1 is a fairly wide, and it might even be tarmacked or gravel covered track. 2 is through the woods, but it's going to be just on earth, grass maybe. 3 is through an opening, a meadow in the wood, and that obviously will be grass. And then we go back into the wood, and maybe here 4 is different from 5 because of the tree species being different, or this area being coppiced and that area not. So the point is, you have different sections so that you can record different types of habitat. There'd be very little point really doing a transect where you only walk through the same habitat, literally the same, all facing south, all getting the same amount of wind chill, all with grass exactly the same height. It wouldn't make much sense. So the idea is to have a section for each different sort of habitat you encounter, and try to get all the habitats at this site into your walk without making it such a long walk that you have to have a lie down halfway round. Now you might think that sounds a bit daft, but unfortunately quite a lot of people, when they set up transects, are so enthusiastic, and they often set them up in the winter, that they'll walk around and they'll set up a transect which they can easily do at 1 hour 45 minutes in the winter when they're moving very briskly to keep warm. Then they go back in the summer to walk it, and there's thousands of butterflies to count, and I mean thousands, and they discover it takes them 3 hours to get round, and they're baked and parched. So do give careful consideration to your transect, ideally being less than an hour, maybe 45 minutes is a maximum. at a very slow pace, not galloping around because you won't have time to identify things. Okay, so I'm going to go a couple more slides and then I'll see if we've got any questions. Transect walks we're talking about now, not the WCBS, are undertaken every week, once a week, between the 1st of April and the 30th of September. It could be different people walk different weeks. It might be, and the UK BMS prefer this, the same person walks every week. But that's a tall order. Most people don't want to give up their entire life to be available to walk that every week. And the time that you set off is usually after 10:45 and up to about 3:45. But if the weather is really hot, one of those glorious summer days that we seem to get about 3 times a year, and you know it's going to be 18, 90 degrees from the time you get up out of bed, up to about 30 by the middle of the afternoon, then you might want to go really early. You can start at 10. And if it's one of those days when it is really hot, you might want to wait until it cools down again in the evening and set off at 3:45 to get finished by 5 o'clock. But it's got to be good weather, and it's got to be especially good weather for this 10 to 5 o'clock thing. These walks for the WCBS are far more infrequent. You can go once in July and once in August, or you could go twice in July, which is what's recommended actually, and once in August, or you could go up to 5 times by adding in one walk in May, one walk in, they suggest, early July, late July, early August, and late. But please notice it does say here at least 10 days apart. So you've got to leave it more than a week between the walks. And if you're thinking, why haven't they said June? Well, the answer is there aren't very many butterflies about in June. Have their peak population. Please note that the tracking the impact WCBS squares, Nick is saying it may matter too much precisely when possible to perhaps 2 weeks apart as a minimum, and miss out June completely might be my advice. Got exactly the same conditions about times and the weather conditions. So the only difference between the transect and the WCBS in terms of walking is that the transect's every week and the WCBS far less frequent. Both of them tell you that you must have these conditions: 60% sun, above 13 in sunny weather, or above 17, you can even go out if it's cloudy. And the wind speed should be below 5, because as it says here, above 5, you should not walk. Doesn't matter how hot it is, doesn't matter if it's been windy for several days, there's no point. Butterflies do not like to move about when the wind is above 5 on the Beaufort scale. This walking lark means a steady pace. And remember, in the summer, when you're trying to separate small from Essex skipper and both those from large skipper, when you're trying to separate the male ringlet and the male meadow brown, when you're trying to decide if the female meadow browns are gatekeepers or not, it's going to be tricky. If you're lucky and any of the whites stop within your assigned blocks, then you're going to have to try and sort the small from the green vein of the large, another complication, and maybe female brimstone. So you have to go slowly in the summer, and you're supposed to walk the same pace in the spring and the autumn or late September as you do in the summer. So go what seems like ridiculously slowly to begin with, because when you get there in the summer, you'll realize This pace wasn't so daft after all. I've hardly got time to count things and write them down, even moving slowly. Um, you're not supposed to stop, having just mentioned stopping to write them down. You're not supposed to stop when you're in the middle of a section. You're supposed to wait till you get to the end and then write down what you've seen and the percentage of time the sun was shining. But many people say to me in the summer, that is ridiculous. I can't do it. Nobody could do it. And I think that's probably true. So there is license that when you're trying to count the numbers of 17 different species flying around you in the summer, you probably need to stop every 4 or 5 paces. It depends on your on the site that you're walking, doesn't it? Transects have got no limit to their size, but if you're wise, you won't make them too big. They've got no limit to the number of sections. So although the sheet has space for 15, if you want, you can have more and just use 2 sheets. But the wider countryside butterfly surveys always have 10 sections, and they are approximately 200 meters long. And they're in 2 parallel groups of 5. So you walk out 1,000 meters one way, that's 5 times 200, and then you turn round and come back on a parallel route 5 times 200 meters, again another kilometer. So it's going to take you about 45 minutes to an hour, just like the transect, of a sensible size, because it takes you about that long to walk 2 kilometers very slowly. Now I've put this at the bottom and lots of people will tell me I don't really like doing that. Well, okay, but what you really shouldn't do is walk with someone else and let them tell you that they've just seen something that you missed, because you'll be very tempted to write it down. You missed it, so you shouldn't. And they might say something like, can you hear that bird? Do you know what that is? I think that, do you think that could be a nightingale, for instance? And you're distracted. And while you're telling them that you're not sure if it is a nightingale, you thought maybe it was a willow warbler. You failed to identify a couple of skippers that were sat there because you were thinking about something else. So if you are going to walk with someone, you could either, if you feel like delegating, say to them, could you please count the blues, even though you know there won't be very many. You count the blues and I'll do everything else. And that relieves you of a job. It keeps them quiet too. Don't let them talk to you and distract you. Don't let them talk to you and tell you that you've missed something, because it's so tempting when they say, do you know you just trod on a purple emperor and you didn't see it? Do you think, oh, I better write that down then, because that's quite important, isn't it? But you are supposed to be doing your recollection of what you saw a few seconds earlier onto that piece of paper. I've gone through most of that, I think. Last bit at the bottom here is the only bit I didn't say. Far better to have 2 shorter walks than 1 very long one. For one thing, think about the fact that eventually you're going to want other people to help out on this, because no matter who sets up the transect, the day will come when they think, I need help. And if you ask someone, would you like to walk this route that takes just over 3 hours in the middle of the summer? Or if you say to them, would you like to walk this route that takes about an hour in the middle of summer? You can guess which one sounds more appealing. Okay, I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions about what I've said so far. And I do apologize for going so fast. So if
We've
you'd like
got
to unmute, yep,
we've
please
got a
go.
couple on. It's Anna, Nick. We've got a couple on the chat.
Yep,
If I can go through those first.
sure, absolutely.
So one from Iona. Apologies if I've said the name wrong. Is it acceptable to catch butterflies that you are not sure of and take pictures of them, or would that slow down things?
Right, answer is, as you walk along, if you can net things which are flying past you or right by you without stopping to any extent, catch them, keep them in the net until you get to the end of the section, and then by all means take a photo before you start the next section. So you could either do that, or alternatively, you could walk the whole section. And if these were male butterflies, they're probably on territory. So you could go back into the section and catch them to have a look at them, because once you get to the end of the section, you are allowed to pause. And if you need to, have a drink, eat a sandwich or something, and then start the next section. So it's in the sections you're not supposed to stop, because there is the obvious danger that while you're stopped trying to catch something and take its photo, butterflies that were behind you have now flown past you back in front, and you'll count them again. You'll count them twice. So yes, if you can catch something as you're walking along, and if you can catch the whites while you're walking along, that's not only very clever, but really helpful. And then look at them when you get to the end of the section. I sometimes do it with the skippers too. I'll net 4 or 5 tinier, the tiniest skippers, small and Essex, and look at them when I get to the end of the section. And you've only walked perhaps 50 meters since you caught them, so it's not going to damage their chances greatly to release them there. They'll go back to where they were. Next question, please, Anna.
Thank you. It's more of a comment, I think, this one. NTWCBS type surveys want 4 to 6 visits between mid-June and end of August.
Yes.
And WCBS have less than 10 sections, can have less than 10 sections.
No.
If part of the square is inaccessible, such as lake, impenetrable scrub, etc., but can't drop too low, otherwise the square is regarded as undoable.
Yes, that's true.
Okay.
I mean, if you really have to, you can have fewer than 10, but that isn't advised. And if you've got a particularly difficult square, we'll come to this later, then the WCBS might well assign you to a different square, because they'll accept nobody can walk this and get sensible results from it. It's just not possible, because, for instance, there's a river, a lake, a railway line, whatever it is that blocks the way.
Thank you. Can you please explain 2 parallel groups?
Yeah, it's sorry, that's my pronunciation. It's 2 parallel routes, ROUTES. And we'll be going through this a bit later. I'll show you. It isn't especially clear. And if you're still struggling when I've been through that later, ask me again and I'll make a third attempt. But it's probably best to wait and see what your WCBS site looks like, and then you'll get a much better idea. So we'll go through it again later, but it's far easier to understand it when you're actually on the ground than it is to look at a picture on a screen and see what I'm talking about.
Thank you.
Next question, please.
If there are no suitable weather condition days within a week, do you miss a week of transect data? Would you do anything to compensate? For example, do extra the next week?
Okay. I've got a slide about that in a minute, but I'll deal with it very quickly. If you know that last week was rubbish and you couldn't get out, this week looks like being rubbish and you won't get out, and the long-term forecast suggests that next week is going to be rubbish as well, go anyway, even though the weather conditions are not good enough. Choose the sunniest day, because a day when there is sunshine, even if there isn't the right temperature, will yield some results. So yes, you do need to go out very occasionally. You do need to go out even though the conditions are below the minimum. Otherwise, you get such a big hole in the data you're collecting that the data isn't very useful. But we'll come back to that.
Thank you. A couple more. How do you deal with the grid reference when you're walking quite a distance?
I don't deal with a grid reference. Well, I'm not quite sure what the question means, but when the transect was set up by whoever set it up, they should have recorded on a separate sheet, which we're not worrying our little heads about, on a separate sheet, the exact grid reference at the beginning and end of each section. So all you do is write down which section you're in, and all the background information about where the section begins and finishes will be stored at the UK BMS. They will worry about that for you at some later date. Hope that makes that clear, but ask me again if there's a point there I've missed. Looks like we're getting more and more questions. Carry on, Anna.
Yeah. What is the best method of measuring percentage sunshine? Should we be using some sort of measuring device?
No, I'll go through that again as well in a minute, and we'll definitely do that on the training days. It's so easy when you're on the training day to show people, and slightly difficult now. So I think that's coming up later, but if I don't go back to it, please remind me. I think we've got a point about that later. Yep, next question.
Great. And last question for now. Can you recommend a butterfly identification guidebook to improve knowledge before recording?
That's a question I'm not the best person to ask because I don't really use them. I personally prefer the books which have got illustrations by Richard Lewington, and there are several of those. Other people say, oh no, I prefer the photo guides because I like to see pictures of them looking like they're really looking real life as they are in the books. If you want, whichever book you're going to get, try and get the most recent edition because it's helpful to see in the distribution maps that come alongside the description of each species where it flies. Because if you see something and think, well, I didn't know that was supposed to be in this area of Britain, if you look at the distribution map and find, oh, it is, then that makes it more likely, doesn't it? If you look at the distribution map and it says it's not in this area, and that tends to make you think, well, could it have been something else? And then perhaps you can go through the guide and find, oh, there's another butterfly that looks like that, which is in this area, so it was probably that. But as I already said, I think taking an identification guide with you in the field, not a very good idea. If you start at the beginning of April, there'll be so little to see that you'll very quickly get used to the few butterflies species you see then. And as the year goes ahead, you can add 2 or 3 species each week to begin with, and then 2 or 3 species, perhaps every couple of days later as you come in contact with them. And that makes it fairly easy. There's not all that many butterflies in our area. I think you'll be fine. And that's why we do all the ID walks. Quick plug now, because Nick Mariner wanted me to mention this, and I was supposed to remember it at the end, but it's come up. We're running a lot of ID training this year. So I've got 8 sessions. 2 of them are online like this, and a whole load more in the field. But other members of Butterfly Conservation are also running ID sessions where we're going to go out to places where we know there are these confusion species that people have trouble with. We're going to catch them. We're going to put them in glass pots or plastic pots so that people can compare the 2 similar species side by side. Everybody get a good look. Then we release them. And then we go and we find another one of those 2, put it in a pot and give it to people and ask them which one it is. So it really helps people to gain confidence. There's going to be lots of training this year in how to ID things confidently and, of course, correctly. Okay, I'm going to move on again, please. I know
Sorry.
you've got 3. Go on then, Anna.
No, sorry, Nick. It's just to say that there's a few recommendations for books from people in the chat. I won't read them out, but if you're
Oh,
interested, then have a look.
that's superb. That's
Yeah,
superb. If people can look at that, because I just can't remember their titles. It's so
no,
long
that's
since I
fine.
bought
And
one.
also, and just to follow on from another thing that Nick Mariner wanted us to say was that if you're on the call, but you're not currently involved in tracking the impact, then we do have some squares available. So I'll put Nick's contact details in the chat so that anyone who wants to get involved can. Okay, that's
Yeah,
me.
thank you. He asked me to say that he's got 19 squares, and I've got a map later showing where our vacant squares are, and I was going to mention it then. But I'll come back to that, a bit like the sunshine, if I remember. That's all right. Thanks
Yep.
very much, Anna.
Okay.
Okay, so WCBS walks, where can you go? Well, the answer is you have to go where we've got squares. That is to say, we, the Upper Thames branch of Butterfly Conservation, have got squares which we were given on an entirely random basis. If you want to walk in the Chest Valley or the Chilterns, you can walk in the squares randomly allocated by the Chilterns ANOB, or National Landscapes as they are now. So you can't just go anywhere you like. Not allowed. You've got to go to the places which have been randomly assigned. And that's part of the standardization, because transects, as you can imagine, because people can go wherever they want, it's almost never that a person sets up a transect around Sainsbury's car park or an office block. They always go to the really top nature reserves or bits of private land where they know there's good stuff to look at, good insects to look at without lots of people about. They very rarely choose bad places to walk a transect. Why would you? And the result is that we get a skewed idea of how well our butterflies are doing, because all the transect results come back. Well, there's loads of these. If we looked at the countryside in a more logical, rational way, we'd say, Christ, there's nothing about. Haven't seen a butterfly all day. So the randomization of WCBS squares is to make sure that Some of the WCBS squares actually are taking you around an office block and through a Sainsbury's car park. Other supermarkets are available. And some of them will be across arable land, which is even worse because there's hardly even a hedge, just a footpath maybe across some mud. And some of them will be in quite nice places. Fairly often people have picked up a WCBS square and said, well, I never would have dreamt of going there, except that this square was available, so I had a look at it. And actually, there's some quite nice bits that you wouldn't notice normally. So, they're a real mix, and that's the whole point. It gives a much more accurate view of what's going on. Ignore that map. This is something we do need to talk about, though. If you're doing a transect walk, and this causes perplexity to some people, but in order to standardize it, we've already said you're walking at a very slow, steady pace, and you're only counting the butterflies inside what people refer to as an imaginary box. So you can imagine, if you like, that you're walking inside this transparent box, which goes up for 5 meters, goes ahead of you for 5 meters, and extends 5 meters to your side. Now, in this picture, the little person in the middle there is placed centrally with 2.5 meters either side. But it could be, and it might suit you, to make that all 5 meters on one side of you and nothing on the other, or 3.5 meters one side and 1.5 the other. It doesn't matter, but the total has to be 5. There is an exception to this. If you're walking in a woodland ride or down a footpath with hedges either side, and the hedges are, let's say, 6 meters from one another, and you're walking along there, you could do that as long as everybody else who walks that transect route also counts all the way between both hedges. If it's only 4.5 meters between the hedges, count into the hedge as well, because butterflies will settle in the hedge, but make sure that everyone else who walks that route follows the same protocol. So if you're in a space where there's sort of no limit to how wide you could count, like going across a grassy field, you've got to be able to judge your 5 meter box. In a space where the edges are constrained by something like a ditch or a hedge or a wall, then you can work out for yourself where's the most sensible place to walk and make sure that everyone else in the transect team knows we always walk along this bit of the footpath and we always count to our left 5 meters, or left 1 meter and right 4 meters, whatever makes sense on the ground where you are. But the total usually is 5 meters across, 5 meters in front, and 5 meters above. Now, the 5 meters in front does cause trouble because we say you should never count up anything that's behind you. And of course, people see a single, very rare butterfly that flies in from just outside their 5 meter box from in front of them. They see it coming because it's huge. It's something like a swallowtail. It comes in from in front of them and it's just over 3 meters to their right. So it's outside the box they've agreed they're going to walk on that particular section. And it goes behind them and settles right behind them within 0.5 meter and think, well, I've got to record that because it's a swallowtail. Come on. But no, you don't. You only record what's in the box, no matter how rare or common. You wouldn't feel the same compunction to record a meadow brown, would you? You only record what's in your box, and the box should be, on almost all occasions, 5 meters wide, 5 meters high, and up to 5 meters ahead. Good luck, by the way, identifying anything that's 5 meters above you against the sky. I'm not quite sure why they've made it that height, because it's very difficult to identify anything up there. But there you are, that's the rules. Now, this is for transect walks. See if you can spot the difference when I go to the WCBS. There we are, that's the WCBS. What's the difference? And some of you might have spotted it's a trick question. They're identical. Transect, WCBS. They both assume that you're walking inside this imaginary box, which is 5 by 5 by 5. So here we go. Only count butterflies you can identify with 100% certainty, and you never count anything that's behind you or flies from behind you to go in front. You never count anything that's outside the box, but you can, as the person who asked me about catching them and taking a photo later, estimate them when you get to the end of a section. The most reliable thing, as we already recovered, is from a single person, because if they walk it every week over several years, they will make mistakes. We all make mistakes, but they will make reliable mistakes of the same sort all the time, so the data becomes better than if, let's say, in 2021, person A walks it, in 2022, person B, in 2023, person C, and now in 2024, it's another new person, person D. They will all have their foibles. They will all have trouble deciding quite where their 5-meter box is. Some will have a slightly smaller box, some will have a slightly bigger. Some will overestimate the number of Essex skippers or green vein whites. We all make little mistakes like that, but if it's the same person year after year walking the same route, these things don't matter so much, because it's, repeatable. It's the repetition that makes it work. Sunshine. I said we were coming to this. I thought we were. So sunshine is one that catches people out. The first thing to say about how do you know whether you're estimating it correctly, it's the time. It's not how bright it is. It's nothing to do with how bright it is per se. If it's bright enough that you can see a shadow. Now, what I do, and I'm hoping to be able to show you this on Saturday, the forecast at the minute is for sunny intervals. So that'll be perfect. What I do, if I lift my foot off the ground, maybe half a meter, and look down at the floor, and there is no discernible difference between the land, the ground directly under my foot compared with around it, that's not sunny. That's zero sunshine. But if it's even slightly darker under my foot, if there's a hint of a shadow, then that's 100% sunny. And what we're interested in is the time. So as you walk along the section, you could either note in your head how much of the section in 10% increments how much was with no sunshine on it, or you could have conversely how much of the time was with 100% sunshine. So as soon as you see that there are shadows, it's sunny, and it doesn't make any difference whether you're under a tree. It's whether the sun is shining strongly enough to cause shadows if you were in the sun. So if you go under trees, that doesn't mean it's 100% shade. It means you need to know by looking whether the trees are throwing a shadow. If they are, that's 100% sun. The fact that you're in the shadow of the tree doesn't mean it isn't sunny. It means you're in the shadow of the tree. So under the trees, in the lee of a building, whatever it is, where you're in the shade, the question you've got to ask yourself is, how long was the sun shining even though I wasn't actually in the sun? Hope that makes sense. I might get some more questions about that because I don't think I described it very well. Anyway, temperature in the shade, we talked about that. Minimum requirements, did I mention that yet? 13 degrees C. Yes, it was in a slide earlier, wasn't it? Except on those days when you know damn well all last week was wet and only 11 degrees C. All this week so far has been slightly better because it's been wet, but it's been 12 degrees C. Tomorrow they forecast it's going to be 12 degrees C and sunny. Well, get out and do it, because although that's below the minimum requirement, better to get some results when you've already missed a week. Make sure you note absolutely precisely that it was below the minimum requirements. Don't cheat and say, well, it was 13, probably, maybe. Put down that it was 11 or 12, and the algorithms back at the UK BMS will work on that and make allowances for it. Wind speed, we talked about it. You need to know it, but we have to go in that on the day, I think, because it's a bit too difficult to describe. There is, on the UK BMS website, there's quite a lot of explanation of how you can judge it. Now we go back once more to this question about What happens if you've got some bad weather? Well, occasionally I see that some people, some transect walkers, have actually managed to walk every week. I don't know how they do it. They're walking around in this country. They're not in Bermuda or somewhere, and yet apparently they find perfect conditions every week. I do not do that. I don't think many of you will. Don't worry. Don't beat yourself up. Every single transect data set that is sent in is likely to contain some missing weeks because the weather isn't going to play ball with you. It might be that there is a really nice day in the week, and that's the one day when unfortunately you've got to go to the dentist, so you can't get out. It happens. A small number of missing values, it says, can be automatically estimated. So you do the weeks that you can, and if there's a few gaps, don't worry, won't matter. The algorithms will fill it in for you. But if 3 weeks together, if there's a block of 3 weeks with no data, then the algorithm will literally fall over and say, can't do it, impossible. And that makes your set of data collected pretty much useless, I'm afraid. Certainly for that period of time, the spring or the midsummer, whichever 3 week period it is when you didn't get any data. So that's why I'm saying if you know you're likely to get a 3 week gap, better to walk, even though it's slightly below the minimum. Now, this is the sort of data set you'll collect at the end. You'll notice there's an awful lot of zeros. I do sometimes hear from people who've been out walking their transects and they get in touch and say, I must be doing something wrong because I'm hardly seeing anything. No, you're doing something absolutely right. It's the people who tell me they've been out and seen 39 dingy skippers, 14 green hair streaks and 12 brown argus, along with 15 other species on the second week of April that have me worried, because you shouldn't be seeing very much. In these first few weeks, apart from brimstone here, look, there's going to be virtually nothing. It's not until we get right through to July that numbers start to pick up. And even then, for most walks, the numbers will be low. So you should expect to be getting low numbers. It doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means you're recording accurately the fact that there aren't many things to see. This is a data set that's been filled in on the UK BMS website. So after you've filled it in, it will look like this. I think in a bit we see the page where you go to fill it in, but I'm just showing you that you get these gaps. And if you look, you will see that there are some weeks, like here, the 6th of May and the 13th of May, there are 2 weeks there where it was impossible to get out. The weather was so poor, and we missed April the 22nd too. So there's a big hole in the data there, but the algorithms will sort it out. So this data that's been collected here produces these totals at the end of the year for each of the sections, and sorry, for each of the species. And then the algorithm starts to fill in the missing data, and we get that this is what we actually recorded, but you get something called the index. Couldn't remember the word for a moment. You get something called the index, which is where the algorithm calculates what you would have seen if you had good weather every week. Now, I'm sure that some purists are going to say, well, that's a bit daft. Why bother walking around? Well, the answer is the data that you collect is what informs this, and it wouldn't be anywhere near accurate if they simply guessed based on previous years or whatever. So you collect most of the data, but this particular species that's gone from 29 seen to an index of 44 was one that was assumed would have been flying in the weeks when you didn't get to count because of bad weather. And that's how many the algorithm, based on many, many, many years of thousands of records, that's what it knows would have been seen. So obviously you could argue, well, it's not a perfectly scientific way of doing it, is it? No, it's not. It's not. It's not perfectly scientific, but it's a lot better than just guessing what's out there. Some of the numbers don't really change at all. Like one of this stayed at 1 because you didn't actually miss a week when it would have been flying. Others go up slightly and some go up massively, but 17 to 23, 21 to 35. Anyway, I don't need to read them all out. This one has doubled, 30 to 60. So the algorithm will fill in missing weeks. Don't get too hung up about it. It will happen. So I'm going to talk now, 2 more slides, and then I'll take some more questions. For both the Transect and the WCBS, these things on the screen here are identical. They're exactly the same, whichever of those 2 standardized surveys you're walking. Fixed route, slow, 5-meter box. Identify for certain, those are the only ones you write down. Appropriate weather conditions are a must. Count between these times. Make sure you record the weather conditions on your sheet. And then both of them expect you to register and upload the records to the UK BMS website at the latest by the beginning of October. But most of us do it every week as we go along, because then people can see that we are actually going out and doing it. You can imagine there's a certain amount of trepidation in the hearts of those who set all this up. If they look at a particular site, let's just pick on a name of a wood, Bagnall Wood, where there's been a Transect run for years, and they look in September and there's not a single thing recorded for that wood this year, they begin to think, well, perhaps the Transect organizer is ill, gone away, what's happened? So if you can, get on and upload your records every month through the year. It's perhaps a bit easier anyway to do it frequently because you've got less to put in then. And there are some differences between Transect and WCBS on the next slide. So a minimum number of walks for the Transect is 26. You're supposed to try and walk every week between the 1st of April and the 30th of September. And the WCBS, the absolute minimum is 2, but they would prefer you do more. But it doesn't fail to be useful if you only do 2. When? April to September. WCB, this is the Transect, sorry, April to September. And the WCBS, it's best if you can do something in May and add some more later. July and August are the key times because that's when the most species are flying. Sites and their length. Well, you can site your Transect anywhere you like, provided the person who owns the land agrees. And you can make any length you like, but you would be very wise to keep it to a sensible length that you can walk in about 45 minutes. If it needs a longer Transect, that is to say, if there's a bigger route that could be walked through lots of different habitats, split it into more than one Transect. And then with the WCBS, the sites are allocated on a random basis. You cannot choose. You can pick between the ones that are allocated, but you cannot choose to go somewhere and just walk one and then claim that you've walked a WCBS because they won't accept it. And they are always, we had somebody saying earlier, quite rightly, sometimes they're not quite 2K. That's true, but the vast majority are 2K, and some, just as we heard, some are a bit shorter, some are slightly longer because you go outside. At the end of the first 1 kilometre, you'll go outside the box, the 1 kilometre square that you've been allocated, to find a footpath and come back parallel to the path you walked originally. So they might end up being 2¼ kilometres by the time you've got round. I did say I'd stop there, so I will, because that next slide's a bit mind-boggling. So what questions have we got, please? This is a chance for everybody to put lots of questions in the chat so that Anna can't keep up. Come on, challenging you. Can you go faster than Anna can read them out?
There's only one at the moment. Come on, people. So what do you mean by difficult species can be estimated at the end of a section? Do you mean that you don't have to be 100% certain for difficult species?
Yes. When you're walking the section, because you're not supposed to stop, you think to yourself, ooh, that was either a this or a that. You don't write anything down. When you get to the end of the section, if you think it'll be possible to go back into the section and catch these difficult butterflies, then you can look at them properly and write down what they were. But it would be better if there are difficult species and you can't decide between them, that you write nothing down actually if you can't catch them. But very often people find the Essex and small skipper difficult for very good reason. They are difficult and they're small. So they go back when they finished a section and net 5 or 6 of them and have a look to see what they are. And if it turns out that they're all one species, then if you saw about 15 in the section, you say, well, they're all the same species. But if they turn out to be mostly one of the species, you use the percentages that you've caught when you caught a few to estimate what was there. I hope that's clear, but come back to me in the chat again, folks, if that doesn't make sense.
Thank you.
There's
And
another
then,
question.
yeah, do transect sections need to be continuous? Can there be small breaks between them?
There can, and there can be small breaks between bits of WCBS as well. So it's not ideal, but I do know of one WCBS, which I think actually has now been abandoned as being too dangerous. But there was a section of dual carriageway in the middle of it, and it was set up, but people obviously didn't try and count when they walked across the dual carriageway because they'd have been squashed. So there was a gap in the middle. In that particular case, they walked, I think it was 3 sections, then they went over the road and then they started again to do 2 more. So yes, it's entirely possible. You don't have to be walking continuously. And indeed, I would say, if you know there's a very long section of extremely similar habitat, make only part of it a section. And if you've got to walk through the rest of it to get to the next bit for the next section, just don't record there. Have a little rest. Look at the various other things around you apart from the butterflies and listen to the birds. Enjoy yourself without struggling to count everything for long periods over sections where you're going to get very similar results anyway. Oh, Anna, we've beaten them. We've answered all the questions without any more coming in.
I have a question.
Oh, okay, please.
Okay, last year was my first year doing
Right.
WCBS. And when I walked it initially, it was quite clear walking. But come later in the summer, nettles had grown up enormously, and it was really hard to get through them. So fortunately, it was April but then I changed the route in May because I couldn't do it. But of course, I guess that negates the whole thing if you don't follow the same route every time, exact route.
Yes, I think that's one of the reasons, especially with transects, I say to people, if you're going to walk one for the first time, if this year is your first year, why not do it without actually logging it on the UK BMS the first year? Because there's every chance when you get to September, you're going to say, I wish I hadn't set it up exactly along this route. I hadn't realized these brambles were going to get so big. I hadn't realized that, this bit of ground gets so boggy after rain. And I needed to skirt round something. So it's definitely a good idea to walk them. And as you've just said, did I see your name was Michael?
Yeah.
As you just said, Michael, very wisely, you go out in April. It sounds like you did exactly the right thing. You went out in April and walked it before you started in earnest, as it were. You made a decision about where your 200-meter sections were going to go. Very, very wise. But of course, the way it looks in April and the way it looks in July are different.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it was a learning curve, really.
Yes, it will be anyone walking anywhere for the first time. If you're picking up one that somebody else walked, they can probably give you a few hints. But if you're starting a completely new one, sometimes you have to say, I was wrong, and start again. And I'm afraid you are right that if you change the route, if we change the route fairly considerably, not if we just walk round a tree that's fallen over because the wind blew it down, but if we change the route to a significant amount, the transect will be declared null and void and it will have to be restarted under a new name. And you might, if you ever look at all the transect results for the Upper Thames branch area, you'll see there at some places the name might be Wittenham New Transect because there used to be one and then they had to change it because, I don't know, a fence went in or a ditch was dug. So yes, you have to try and stick to the same route. So it's best to, when you're planning it at the very beginning, to make leeway for the fact that in the summer there's going to be nettles and brambles and other hazards that aren't quite so obvious in the spring. But a very good point, a salient thing to have brought up. Thank you, Michael. I hadn't thought to say that, so that's really helpful.
Yeah, good. Okay, thanks.
Do we have any other people who'd like to jump in and be brave and speak? Okay, well, I'm going to carry on and suggest that everyone holds on to something firm for the next slide. So the very big box that you can see here, I'm just going to take a drink, excuse me. Right, that's perhaps slightly better. So this very, no, it's not, is it? Excuse me. Right, try again. The big box here on the left. This is an idealized, and Michael would tell you, completely unrealistic WCBS route. You've been allocated a 1 kilometer square, and by some divine intervention, way back when in the Middle Ages, people set up a footpath here, going across the habitat in a dead straight line, and then you walk just outside the box and you can very easily get back to another footpath, which for some bizarre reason runs parallel to the first, back approximately to where you started. You will notice that these two routes are 500 meters apart, which is the closest they are supposed to come. And each 200-meter section very neatly adds up till you get 1 kilometer out, walk along a bit and come 1 kilometer back. Of course, this is not the way things are in real life. And so on the right-hand side, you can see some examples of squares which are a bit more realistic. So at the top left here, we've got a slightly zigzaggy footpath, but we can believe that. It's got a part here where it crosses a road, but, well, that's just unfortunate. That's provided it's a quiet country road, that's not such a problem. And then it comes back about parallel to the way it started, even though there's a kink in it just there. And there's a bit at this end, look, where we're not counting it as a section because it would have given us too much ground. We're only supposed to be covering a total of 2 kilometers. And if we'd walked all the way to the edge of this 1K square, that would have added extra space because the kink in the line means that this line here is the full 1 kilometer before it reaches the edge. In the next square to the right, top right, you can see we've got a real problem. This represents either a lake or the coast. This square cannot be walked. It might be, if you get back to the person who's helping to allocate these squares, they will say to you, yeah, you're quite right. Either, depending on how much of the square you can't walk, you could walk a bit in the adjacent square as you come into it. Or it might be they'll say, no, I'm sorry, we're going to scrap that square. We'd not realized they're all allocated randomly. We don't look to see what's there because that's half the point. If we took all the ones out that we didn't like the look of, we'd end up with a non-random allocation. But they will then allocate a different square if you find something as disastrous as that. Let's go down to the bottom left. This one's a bit like the one above it at the top left. Yes, it's perfectly feasible, assuming you can get from this point here, where that first path ends, that's the end of the kilometer walking the sections, and assuming that this footpath now goes out of the square so you can get back in on this path, that one's quite straightforward. The distance between them just here might be a bit closer than the 500 meters that you're supposed to stay apart, but it's acceptable because most of the way you are 500 meters apart. So we're unlikely to get perfection. Minor imperfections like being a little bit close at one point is, that's something we can live with. On the right hand side, we've got another similar thing, 2 wiggly lines. The only problem I see with these is that they could well be quite a long, not a problem in terms of recording, but a problem for the walker. It might be quite a long way outside this square to get back to the other 1 kilometer of walk. But all these things are slightly different, and you have to judge them when you get there and look around on your first walk, which, if you're wise, you'll do before the season starts, so that you've walked and considered different options. And most squares, I can't say this is all squares, but most squares allow a choice of different bits that you could walk, usually on a footpath, or if you can get in touch with a landowner, perhaps by walking along a hedge line where perhaps they've got a wildflower margin or something. There's usually some way that you can concoct to get your 2 kilometers in, but you have to go and see the square. They're all different. So I hope that's clear. There was a question about what did I mean by parallel routes. The truly parallel routes are in this idealized square, but that's so unlikely. I bet no one's got a square as good as that. Most often the parallel routes are not truly parallel, but they're approximately parallel. And it doesn't matter whether they run east, west, north, south, or any other orientation on the compass. So perhaps I better just stop, because I see chat's now completely full of things. What do we want to ask about this, please?
Okay, so are the tracking the impact walks transect walks or like WCBS walks? Which should we set up?
Well, we shouldn't set up any, because the tracking the impact have already allocated the squares, and they're WCBS style walks. So they're the less frequent WCBS walks, and they're either in the Chess Valley or the central Chilterns between Wendover and High Wycombe sort of area. But they've all been allocated. That is the sense. If you ask Nick Mariner, if you tell him roughly where you'd like to walk, then he can tell you what's close to where you've said, which squares have not yet got a walker. He hasn't got all that many squares in the middle of the Chilterns, but there are quite a few in the Chess Valley because they were added recently. So there's 19 squares in total of 70 allocated across the Chilterns.
I think I'm
19
right.
without anyone. Yep.
I
Sorry.
think sorry, I think I'm right in saying, but please correct me if I'm wrong, that if you've been allocated a square already, then Nick will support you to create the route through that square.
Absolutely, he will. And if
Yeah.
if you're not trying to set up a square, or sorry, if you're not trying, be quiet, think. If you're allocated a square by Peter Philp, who does the WCBS squares for the Upper Thames branch, he will equally give you a hand if you go out and look at your square and then get back to him and say, I can't see how to make this work. He'll do everything he can to help you, and so will the people in the office, the head office at Butterfly Conservation. If Peter looks at it and he also thinks, oh my goodness, then the people at head office will come in and give help too. So whichever square you choose, and presumably people will choose one that's fairly close to where they live, there will always be help to make sure that it's both feasible for you to walk it and safe for you to do so.
Lovely, thank you. Can you go through percentage sunshine again, please? If you are under a tree in shade, but the sun is on the tree, is this counted as 100% sunshine?
Yes. Do I need to go
Great.
through it more than that? That's the answer. Yes. If the
Mike?
sun's out, if there is a shadow, if the tree is casting a shadow, that's 100% sunshine. And it's all down to time. It's not how bright the sun is, it's time. If there is a shadow, for half the time that you're walking a section, that's 50% sun.
Thank you. A comment here about WCBS will only accept 4 times 200 meter sections in exceptional circumstances. Minimum distance between transect routes in WBCS is 100 meters.
Is it? Oh, well, in that case, that is my mistake. If it is as close as 100, I thought it was supposed to be wider apart. But thank you. I wouldn't be at all surprised if that's Peter, who I think is on this.
It is Peter.
I noticed.
Well done.
Yep. So, well, he's an expert. He's the man in charge. So thank you, Peter, for correcting me.
Great to have you here. Thank you. Mike is asking, are we going to get copies of the slides? I would imagine that's something that other Nick will send out.
You're recording them, aren't you? So
I am.
they'll be,
Indeed.
and very similar talks have been done before. So on the Upper Thames branch of Butterfly Conservation, if you go to events, online talks, you can find similar things to this which we're doing tonight, which have been recorded previously. And then, of course, you can play through and you can scroll forwards, backwards, pause it wherever you want.
Great, thank you. And then one more. With WCBS/NT farmlands butterfly surveys, is it possible to do more than 6 walks, or does it need to be under this maximum?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, because I lost what you were saying as you said it.
I'm not surprised. With WCBS/NT farmland butterfly surveys, is it possible to do more than 6 walks, or does it need to be under this maximum?
Well, my feeling is, but Peter might like to jump in here and give us some guidance as well. I think the answer is you can do more if you want to, but they will probably pick the ones which are in the middle period, the bit they really want. But I believe you can do more, but they shouldn't be too frequent in terms of being too close together. There is this thing about 10 days apart. Now, I'm not sure if that's true for the National Trust walks, because they've got their own rules, which are slightly different.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please carry on, Peter.
Yes. They wish 4 to 6 between mid-June and the end of August. You can do extra ones, and they will be put to use, but not analysed in the same way as the rest.
Right. And do you know about the NT, Peter? Do they allow...
That's what I'm on about, National Trust.
Oh, the National Trust, they allow it as more frequently. Sorry, shorter intervals between, or is it still 10 days?
You've still got to have a minimum of 10 days between each one.
Right, thanks very much. Yeah, I wasn't sure about that. Right, that's really helpful. Thank you, Peter. What a good thing you're here. Always useful to have an expert on. Right, unless there's anything else has popped into someone's head, I can see. Is that not, it looks like there's something else in the chat. I can see 22.
No, that's all for now.
Okay, thanks very much, Anna. Doing a good job there. Thank you. So, WCBS walks, issues with routes. There's a load there you could try and read. Don't bother too much. We've been through this. If you go out and you look at a square and you think, I can't cope with this, it doesn't work very well, then get in touch with whoever is the coordinator for your particular square. So it will either be Nick Mariner or Peter Philp, or if it's the National Trust, whoever the National Trust line manager is in that case, and ask them what to do. It says here, advisable to make an initial visit, and you just heard from Michael. He did that, but he hadn't allowed for the fact, because he didn't, why would he? He didn't expect the nettles to grow all over the route. So it is a very, very good idea to go out and walk it in April sometime before you start recording for real. But be prepared that the thing will look slightly different in the middle of the summer. Should be possible to get through still. I'm not quite sure what the guidance is about walking through nettles. I think I probably would walk right through the middle. I do on one of my transect routes, but then perhaps it's because I'm a bit stupid. There's plenty of information. I mentioned this at the beginning. If after you've listened to this and maybe watched the videos back, you've still got some queries, you can find it all, or you could go straight here in the first place. There's loads of stuff, information about the wider countryside butterfly survey at the UK BMS, and you can see here the sort of thing that they've got. Yeah, the landowner letter, it is worth mentioning that. If you are going to approach a landowner and say, excuse me, I've been asked to walk this square, but there isn't a footpath that's in the right place, would it be okay to walk along the hedge or the ditch or whatever it is? Then there is a letter you can take with you, but please don't assume, because it is not the case, that the landowner will necessarily agree and say, I'm so pleased to hear that you want to walk on my land. They might not. So do approach landowners if you think it's going to help. Take the letter that you can download from here that proves to an extent that it is a genuine survey. This survey scheme really does exist, but it doesn't give you any special divine right to tell the landowner that, look, this survey exists and you've been allocated, so I'm walking it. No. Don't go about it that way, because that might not end well. Plenty of guidance. And the same with the transect. All the information about how to go about recording, very similar to what I've told you. loads of different bits that you can download if you want to download them, and guidance for walking, the sort of thing we've just talked about. Look, the time of year, 1st of April, blah, blah, blah. How many weeks, time and the weather, time of day, weather conditions, blah. All of this information is on the UK BMS. But again, if you want to ask someone local about a transect that you're walking, then Chapman under if you're interested in the idea of walking a transect, but you'd like to go out with someone else and walk a transect with someone who already does one to see what it entails, then he'll try and pair you up with someone who's already walking so that you can get a feel for it before you dive straight in and say, yes, sign me up to walk for hours every week, please. And that's very helpful. A lot of people either join a team and go out with someone as a buddy, or they go around with someone who mentors them for a few weeks before they go off and try to do their own. Because it is, well, it's actually quite a simple thing to walk a transect, but it sounds a lot when you're listening to it on an evening like this. The transects that need some help this year, and excuse that dreadful map, I have adapted one from last year because it was damn sight quicker than trying to produce it from scratch. So in Burnwood Forest, which is as much in Bucks as it is in Oxfordshire, actually, it's right on the border here, there are 3 transects that need help. And this is because Burnwood Forest still is, but was so immensely brilliant that way back in the 1970s, lots of transects were established there to get baseline data. And they've been kept going for a long time. But as you can imagine, the people who were walking them in the 1970s are now getting to an age where they're finding it more difficult. So there are hair streaks. Here, fairly close. Is another National Trust site. House back towards the village. Based down here near Goring. Established transect with some great species where the people, after a long time of walking it, are beginning to feel that slogging up and down that slope isn't all that good on their knees anymore, so they could do some help. Reading Old Cemetery, I think this is a new transect just being established, and they're trying to get some established site. Sorry, it's some people walking it for older members. I think I can call them that. Might like to help. Now, because this is a bit more helpful. See spots that Peter put together for me, showing where they are more precisely. So Aylesbury's there, look, Oxford's here somewhere. I can't see the word Oxford. It's obviously oh, there it is, Oxford. me being blind, Bicester, Banbury, Chipping Norton, Didcot, Reading here, look, Unitary Authority, and Newbury over here in this bit of West Berkshire, Bracknell. So maybe gives you an idea of where you are. I know some people look at this map and they, to begin with, they're a bit confused because they're not used to seeing a map with these red county boundaries on it. And here's the names of all those different sites, if that helps you. So these generally, these mostly are the name of the closest village. This one, Findmere Wood, is quite well known to butterfly spotters, so we thought that was a better way to describe it. But these are usually the names of the closest village to give you an idea of where they are. So if they appeal to you, that's good. I do not have a map for the WCBS squares within the tracking the impact, but as I said, they're either between a sort of a triangle that goes out from Wendover towards Prince's Risborough and a bit further to the west, and then down to Wickham and back up towards Wendover, or they're in the Chess Valley. And there are quite a few of them in the Chess Valley this year because that's a newly added area. Okay, recording your results. I said I'd come to this eventually. We're nearly at the end, folks. If you've managed to stay awake all this time, well done. And if you haven't lost a few grey cells with struggling to keep up with my poor descriptions, then well done. As I say, very nearly. Look, we're going that last little hill and then it's all downhill in the sun after that. When you go on to the UK BMS site, you'll be registering yourself. You have to register with them in order to record your data. And that has proved to have another benefit, not just that you can go in there and put your data in, but you get insurance. So should you put your foot in a rabbit hole and twist your ankle, have to take a couple of days off, can't go to work or do something important, you would be insured. Now, we're not encouraging anyone to start making lots of claims, but once you're registered with the UK BMS, because you are going to walk and enter data for a transect or WCBS, then that's great because you don't need to worry that you're doing this. And if something goes wrong, well, you know, you've got to pick up all the slack yourself because you'll get help financially should you need it. If, I better mention this now, if you walk any of these routes, but you don't enter the data, somebody else does it for you, and therefore you don't bother to register because you know you're never going to put anything on the website, that probably isn't very helpful because then you'd be walking but without any insurance. So you could either register with the UK BMS as a registered walker of a particular site, even if you don't put data into it, or you could register with something which Butterfly Conservation have, which is called Assemble, and the Assemble registration will give you exactly the same coverage and additionally a whole load of information about all sorts of butterfly related and moth related things that the UK BMS doesn't give you. So Assemble's got more information behind it, including all this UK BMS stuff. But if you're already registered with the UK BMS, you don't need to register with Assemble as well. You're able to, you can, but you don't have to. If you're not registered with the UK BMS, we do recommend, very strongly recommend, that you register with Assemble because no one expects to have an accident, but if one happens and you, for some reason, you have to get private medical care, it's expensive and you might want someone to help you financially. Anyway, back to this and being much more cheerful, you'll see that it's quite straightforward. You've logged in, you've registered, you've told them who you are, you've given them an email address, and then you can get through to this, the data entry, stick your name in, put the date of the day that you did the walk, not the day that you're filling in the data, the time that your walk started, the time your walk ended. What are you going to record? Are you going to record just the butterflies, the moths? Well, in this case, look, I've opted to record all the species of moth which are in this data set, any that I've seen, not all the ones that exist in the UK, but I've told it, expect me to be putting in anything. Dragonflies, I don't do that because I'm not quite so confident about several of the dragonflies, so I don't dare to put them in case I get them wrong. The amount of sun, the temperature, And this is obviously a bit silly because if it was really 1% sun and really 10 degrees C, I wouldn't have walked, would I? Wind direction and speed. And then you go on to the next page by clicking next down here. And it takes you through to this, where here are the sections. And the first thing you look is the percentage sun. Now, because on the previous page I put in that it was 1%, it's automatically filled it. But you can go through and edit these. So you might have had that it was 100% in most of them, but only 90 in a couple. So it can be quicker, not that it matters, but you could put 100 in the first page and then edit these here. Or you could fill all these in separately, doesn't matter. And then you just put the number of butterflies you've seen. If you leave a square blank, it will assume nothing. You can record the butterflies you've seen. You can click on moths and get a list of moths here. Odonata, dragonflies, get a list there. And others, there are various other groups that you can record too. So you don't have to restrict yourself just to the butterflies. And you'll see here, look, you can choose the species lists that appear on this left-hand side, the common species known at this site, which is what I usually use because fairly obviously that's the ones I'm going to see there. Species I've ever recorded, that will be a longer list for all the sites you've recorded on, assuming that you have. And you can add butterflies, and if you were choosing to do the moth page, you could add moths and so on. So it's really very simple. If you've seen 3 of something, you put a 3 in and which section you saw it. And then when you get to the bottom, you just click next and it goes flying off to the people at UK BMS. There are a few other sorts of surveys and one more that the UK BMS look at, which is I've referred to it as reduced effort, because you either look at a single species as opposed to everything. So you might just be looking at, for instance, wood white. Following a standard methodology, we're not going to go into it, but some people really like these. There are quite a lot of people who are so fascinated by a single species that they much prefer to do single species surveys and to learn a great deal about one species rather than walk around recording everything. So this information about this on the UK BMS, I just draw it to your attention because you may be one of those people who thinks, I hope, in addition to walking a transect or a WCBS square, I wouldn't mind doing a single species because a particular species fascinates me. So, for instance, you might go out searching for brown hair streak eggs in the winter. So this doesn't cut across your surveying time in the summer. You might, in the summer, go looking for the larva of the striped lichnis, a really distinctive, very attractive caterpillar. And we have teams of people out searching for that. You might go looking for black hair streak pupa, but actually, since this slide was prepared, which was a few years ago now, there's a new technique looking for black hair streak larvae with UV torches at night. So if you're particularly brave and don't mind stumbling around in the dark with a UV torch, looking at black hair streak larvae is an option. And wood white surveyors, because we've got some colonies, but they're all a bit small and rather feeble and a bit liable to going extinct without help. So we really want people out looking for the wood white too. There are other species that get single species, but I've decided that was more than enough to put into this talk. All the data that you collect, along with all the data that everybody else is collecting, goes off to the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, first of all. Even data about moths goes into this same scheme, actually. And it all gets churned into a big pot to produce official statistics, and you can read all this. All these different tabs will allow you in, if you're registered, to read about everything that goes on. Lastly, a couple of words. I will take some more questions because I know some people have got questions. On Saturday, either with myself or Peter, if you're with Peter, you're over at Buscott, Coleshill, I should say. And if you're with me, it'd be at Presswood. Or in 3 weeks' time, you could go across to Pangbourne, Sulham Estate, near Pangbourne in Berkshire, where Marjorie is doing the same thing again. And we'll meet up. We'll be asking you to let us know who you are and where you expect to do your recording. we're not going to hold you to it later if you change your mind, but it's just helpful to us to know where people think they will go so that we can try and get complete coverage of all the bits we want covering. And then we're going to take one of those sheets we've been looking at. I've actually printed off a load that say transect at the top, but as we've seen, they're effectively the same thing. If you are going to do a WCBS, don't worry about the fact that your sheet will say transect at the top on Saturday, because all the fields which are recorded are identical. And then we're going to lay out, I'm going to lay out, I expect Peter is going to lay out, I don't know whether he's got coloured clothes pegs like me, but something that will represent the butterflies you might survey. And you'll be walking a pretend section and counting the pretend butterflies and making an estimate of whether, if you were walking a real section and those coloured pegs were real butterflies, would you say they were on inside the little imaginary box or outside? It's just to get you used to the feel for how big is this box. And then at the end of all that, we'll retire for a cup of coffee and a biscuit. Tea will be available, I'm sure soft drinks as well. And we'll talk about what issues came up, because when you actually get to walk this for real, you start to think about questions that don't occur to you when you listen to me droning on an evening like this. And I'm really apologetic to anyone who's thinking, Christ, that's a lot to remember. I can't even remember what I was doing before we started listening tonight. My mind's gone completely numb. So yes, it is a lot, but actually it's a lot simpler when you do it. So I'll stop talking unnecessarily and ask Anna, please, are there any more questions in the chat?
There are, yeah, there's a couple. So is there any guidance about walking with dogs?
I think the guidance is probably not to, because as I said about people distracting you, your dog is almost certain to distract you. And I don't know, because I don't know this dog, but I'd be amazed if having a dog next to you didn't scare away the butterflies that you're supposed to be counting. I can't quite see how it would work. If the dog's off the lead, chasing about, it's going to disturb the butterflies. And if it's on a lead right next to you, it's inside your imaginary box, isn't it? Disturbing the butterflies. So I suspect the answer is best not to take a dog. I don't think there is any actual guidance. I've never seen any guidance, but it doesn't seem like the best idea to me.
Thank you.
Next question, before all the dog lovers in the room start throwing things at me.
Lorraine comments that she can probably pick up Mersley.
Lorraine, you're wonderful. Well, Lorraine knows that she's wonderful, but Lorraine, that's great. Thank you. Peter's in on this call and he will have heard that, Lorraine, so you can expect to be assigned. That's Lorraine. Do we say it Mossolf? How does Lorraine say her surname? It's spelt Mossolf, I think.
Oh, yeah. Do you want to perhaps message Peter with your email address or something? Is that a good idea on the chat? You can.
I've got Lorraine's details.
Oh, you have.
She's already doing
Fabulous.
stuff.
Great,
I'll
great,
speak
great.
to her.
Lovely. Thank you. Someone's asking, are there any butterfly identification apps that you can recommend? And someone else has commented, Peter, in fact, that iRecord Butterfly is really useful and free.
Yep. And can I add, sorry, I'm just going to cut in and say, the iRecord Butterfly app, I use it most of my transect walks in the summer, because as we've said, you're going to see butterflies which are outside this box. So the imaginary box you're inside, you're counting everything, but you're going to see things outside the box and you're going to get really cross because you're going to walk your box and the whole way around you're not going to see, for instance, let's just say White Admiral. There'll be none inside your box, but you'll have seen 3 outside it, and it's infuriating. And you think, well, I can't just not record them. So you record them on iRecord. And Peter's quite right. iRecord is a brilliant app because you can look at all the species. It's got really good clear photos, males and females where they're different and everything. So the iRecord app is definitely the way to go. You can use it as an ID guide and you can use it to record what you've seen outside your box. Sorry to interrupt.
Can I just come in on that as well?
Yep, by all means.
The other thing about the app is it uses your GPS on your phone to work out where you are, and it uses the date to work out the time of the year. and the butterflies it lists that you might see are in the order of the most likely for your location and the time of the year.
It's very
A
clever.
brilliant app.
And a question, is there likely to be an infield session in Oxfordshire coming up? To which Peter replies, there's one at Coles Hill on Saturday. Is that this Saturday?
Yes, 2 days
Yeah.
time.
Super. Okay. That's all the questions.
All right.
I'm just going to put some information in the
Well, in that
chat.
case, I'm just going to
Okay.
very quickly then show these maps for people who are coming, I hope, on Saturday to see me at Presswood. So if you're coming down the A413, the much blighted by HS2 A413 from the north here, that would be coming from Wendover. From the south, this would be coming up from Amersham. Presswood Look is just to the west, and Collings Hanger Farm is just on the very edge on this road that goes down towards Wickham. So that's the site at Presswood. And I checked, because we've been asked, would we please not use the main farm entrance? And that meant nothing to me because I didn't even know there was more than one entrance. So I can tell you folks, if you're coming to Collings Hanger Farm and you're coming from the north along this road in a vaguely southerly direction, it's the first entrance to Collings Hanger Farm that we take, which looks like it goes into the farmhouse as opposed to the farmyard. So the first entrance into Collings Hanger Farm, you'll be turning right if you're going south, between two metal gates. They don't want us going into the farmyard because there's some big equipment moving about, and they don't want the drivers of that to have to be constantly worried about running into somebody. So the first gate, as you go south, obviously, if you're going north, it'll be the last gate at Collings Hanger Farm. And then if you're going across to see Peter on Saturday over at the National Trust Coles Hill and Buscott, I can't really zoom in very well and show you precisely where it is, but I'm hoping that there'll be some way that this can be flagged up from the road that runs around the outside of this little estate here. But you're going to go basically west from Farringdon, look, or you could come up north. Well, you can't go quite north because there isn't a road that way, but Shrivenham and Watchfield are down here. Highworth, if you know it, I think Highworth is actually over in, is it in Wiltshire or Gloucestershire? Anyway, it's not quite in Oxfordshire. So this is where you want to go on Saturday if you're going to the Oxford event.
Yeah.
Can you explain just slightly better than that, please?
Yes, Coles Hill National Trust main car park. It's signposted very clearly in the village of Coles Hill, and from the car park, head for the cafe because we're going to start off in the woodshed, which is right next door.
Very good. And it's always a good idea to have a cafe nearby. Yep,
Excellent.
thank you, Peter. And then if you can't get to either of those for some reason, but you could get along to the session that Marjorie is running over in Berkshire. So unfortunately, look, you've got the whole of Reading to contend with if you're coming from the east, but out here in the Sulham estate, just south of Pangbourne, there's Pangbourne. So that's where Marjorie is doing her training. Now, I can't give you any more precise detail than that, but there is, if you go on to the Upper Thames Branch website and click on the events and then choose this event and click on the more information, it'll take you through to the Eventbrite so that you can book, and you'll get all the information you need about precisely where to go when you arrive at the estate, which of the buildings on the estate you're going to, and by registering, Marjorie and all the rest of us will know how many people are coming and they can be suitably prepared. Because I'm really delighted. We've had a lot of people on this call tonight and we've got loads of people coming on Saturday, which is brilliant. But obviously it's much better for us to know that, because then we can put things in place to deal with the crowds. If we thought we were only going to get 2 people, obviously we'd make we'd have less resource for the people who are coming. But as we know we're going to get 50 plus, we can have more facilities prepared for that number of people. So thank you very much. I put this in at the end because, well, it is those of us who've been doing this for years, we really enjoy it. It's great to know it's doing something useful in terms of the statistical outcomes. It's really helpful to know that we're doing something that's genuinely worthwhile. And at the same time, it's just amazingly good fun. I love going out on my transects. There's some of the sites I've been going to since 1980. One of them is 1980. The other one I started in 1982. And I wouldn't have been doing it all this time if it wasn't for the fact that I really enjoy going there and charting the tiny differences that occur year on year. So if you've never tried it, I really hope you like it. Even if it's only half as much as I do, you'll love it. And if you've been doing it for some time, thank you very much. Obviously, you do like it. And if you're here today because you've started it, but you've got some queries, thank you very much for starting. And I hope that you'll find too that as you get into it, it gets easier, because it obviously does, and that it never loses its appeal. I've never yet met someone who walks a transect who says, yeah, but I'm getting fed up with walking transects. It's so boring. Once people get into it, they seem to be sort of stuck with it for life. You know, it's an affliction you can't cure. Okay, there might be some more questions by now, although it could just be people saying, thank you, Peter, you've helped explain those things to Nick very clearly. What have we got, Anna?
It's a lot of people saying thank you, not necessarily specifying, but I'm pretty sure they mean you as well as Philip. Peter, rather, Peter Philip. Sorry, I'm sure that happens a lot.
Did I say Peter, or I don't know?
No.
I might have said said Philip. Who knows what I said?
Anyway,
either way.
We have two questions, or two people asking the same question. Where do you buy nets from?
Well, I personally buy my nets from a company called Watkins and Doncaster, but quite a lot of people use the NHBNS, I think it is, the Natural History Book. I'm not sure what Natural Society, no, that can't, Naturalist Society, perhaps, NHBHS, and that's down in Devon somewhere, Totnes, I think. Watkins and Doncaster is at Hawkhurst in Kent. And then there's another company that sell nets, and they're called Anglian Leps, and they're somewhere in Suffolk. I'm afraid that none of these sources are very cheap, and my advice, if you're as rubbish as I am at doing anything that requires dexterity, buy a large kite net. It's tempting, because you don't want to stand out and look like a nerd, to buy one of the small folding nets. But when you get your small folding net out and try to catch a butterfly, which is highly mobile, you'll soon wish you'd bought the bigger one, because it allows more room for error. When you swipe at it and it moves away before you get there, the bigger nets make up for you missing it slightly and still catch it in the periphery of the net. The smaller nets simply miss and scare the butterfly away. So I'd say get one of the bigger kite nets. And I think all three of the companies sell them. I'm afraid, it depends how rich you are, I suppose, but I think they're all quite expensive. But I've got one now that I've been using. It must be 40 years, mustn't it? They last forever once you've got one. So years of fun. Any more questions, please, Anna?
No, Peter's just put a couple of those names in the chat, which is very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
No further
I can't
questions.
even see the chat to add to it.
No further questions, I don't think, unless we've got any
Anna,
late
we owe you a great debt of thanks too, because you were parachuted in at the last minute, and you've done a sterling job. Thank you so very much. I don't know how we're getting on for time, but it feels like 9 o'clock. Are we thereabouts?
It's 22 minutes past 9.
Okay. Well,
no, it's really
sorry, everybody.
For me as well. So thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everybody. Is there anybody who wants to unmute to ask any question? Because it's easier than writing it into chat, isn't it? No. Seems to me. Yeah. Please. Yeah, no, not too late. Go on.
Just to ask what the difference is, if I'm sure you do know, between what you've been talking about and the BBOUT transects. That's what I've volunteered to do at the minute.
Well, a BBOUT transect follows precisely the same route. The same rules. They are identical. The only difference, I think, is that whereas I'm encouraging everyone to use the UK BMS to enter their data, BBAT have a system usually anyway, where people send all that data off to a person at one of the BBAT offices who
Yeah,
enters it for
seen
them.
that. Yeah.
So
Thank
I
you.
don't think there's any other problem with it. Sorry, not problem. I don't think there's any other difference between them. They both use exactly the same. And indeed, I have on various occasions done the training for the BBAT Transect volunteers.
Yeah,
So
Colin suggested I attend your training, which has been great. I was just checking there wasn't anything I hadn't understood in terms of the method, but that's
right.
fine.
Well, with me explaining it, it's never quite clear that you've understood what you need to know, but it should be the same for both.
Okay, lovely. That was really good. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Jan.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else who has thought they'd like to say something? Okay, well, I'm sorry, everybody, I've kept you half an hour too long. Those who ever been on my things before know that tends to happen.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much for that brilliant information.
You're very welcome. Time to stop recording, I think. Perhaps we
Okay.
should have stopped slightly earlier because we've got all the, well, a